Today's video, I am going to do a step-by-step build of a sliding lid box, specifically this guy right here. And I'm attempting to impart everything I've learned along my way of making many of these. And to show you everything along the way, there will be timestamps below for specific parts if you're just looking for very specific parts that you're hung up on. I know this is a long video, but I wanted to get it all in there so that ideally there are no questions at the end. Now, I just want to say off the bat that everything in this video is how I do it. That doesn't mean it's the right way. It doesn't mean it's the way you have to do it. Maybe not even the way you should do it. But this is how I've kind of learned over time through trial and error and how I make my boxes. So if you want to change something at any point, absolutely feel free to do that. Now, off the bat is wood selection. My selection is based normally on aesthetics. I start by picking the lid. What do I want the statement kind of first visual thing you see if you're standing from above to be? That's the lid. I build around the lid, meaning usually unless I have a size I need ahead of time, I build my box to fit the lids as long as they're within a certain kind of length to fit through the planer. So I need to start out with something 11 inches or over to safely get through the planer. But we can always cut it down afterwards if you want something smaller. So I'm choosing this beautiful piece of quilted maple. Now this piece has a problematic giant knot on it. I'm going to lop that off. It's a little twisted. It's not great. And we're going to be thinning it out quite a bit. So we'll see how that plays, if it plays ball or not later on. The sides are going to be made out of torrefied curly maple. I like the idea of contrasting this. You can go any kind of way you want there. I generally like the minimal side of the box to be the light if I'm contrasting, but you can go the other way. So light lid, dark walls, rather than dark lid, light walls. But if you want to add some other kind of splines or something in there to give a little more contrasting, you can go with a dark lid. That's just my personal aesthetics. I also these days go with solid lid base. I always just use pine from Home Depot. I didn't really like I want to save space in my boxes. And initially I was using 1/2-inch plywood as the base. It took up too much room. A lot of my boxes are kind of 5 inches or less, a lot closer to 3 inches. Losing a 1/2 inch to the base, I didn't like it. So I went away from that. It was also more expensive, but 1/4-inch plywood was not, it just didn't have a kind of value feel, a stability feel. You know, it's okay if it's on the back of a cabinet and it's kind of hidden, something like that. But for the base of a pretty expensive box, I just wanted something a little more, but I also wanted to keep it pretty thin. Of course, I was like, I've got a planer. I'll just make it out of pine. I can buy this in really wide pieces, so my boxes can be wide. I usually keep them 8 inches or under, but 9.5 inches here from Home Depot. And pretty darn cheap. Honestly, kind of cheaper than 1/2-inch plywood for sure for an 8-foot board of this. This piece has some cool, I don't know if that's bird's eye pine. I'm not really quite sure what that is, but I like it. I usually stain the base to match the box, but this one may get left as is. It's pretty cool. So that's how I choose my wood. Now, if you are new to box building, and especially if you're going to follow this into a mitered box, I would not suggest choosing highly figured wood as your early starting. It's the most problematic in terms of twisting, just any kind of movement, tear out, stuff like that. If you're still pretty early on, something straight grained, something not super hard, a domestic, cherry, walnut. I mean, you can start with pine, though if you have a home center, I would suggest poplar. I think it's a great starting wood that's a little better to work with than pine. So poplar, cherry, walnut, soft maple, something like that. And do not go super heavy figure unless you've kind of learned to deal with wood movement, tear out, stuff like that. It can just, you can end up wasting a lot of money if you screw up and it's because of the figure and twist or something like that. So if you're early on, nice and straight grain, nice and simple, you'll get a beautiful box in the end. Now, depending upon the tools you have, this is where I like to mill my wood. So jointer, planer, or just planer sled, planer, whatever you want to do now. We want to get it as close to flat as possible. Ideally, we'd like to do this over 2 sessions, so we'll go ahead and put a flat face. I don't worry so much about the base. When this gets so thin, it cups no matter what anyways. But for the lid and the walls, we want to get one flat face on it and then a tiny little kind of planer swiping off the other side. And that will then ideally let it sit overnight, come back, see what's up. If it's still pretty flat, we just plane it down. If it needs to be rejointed on the face, we do that. Now, I'm going to be real honest here. Each of these has a side that I like a lot more than the other one. I think this side looks better than this side. Normally the advice, the kind of rule to follow is try to take an even amount off of both sides when you're planing, flip it over, and that's best for not getting like cupping and stuff, but I really like this side, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be removing most of the material from the back side, and that will probably cause me problems later. But my boxes I sell kind of based on aesthetics and not just build quality, so it's got to look right. And I'm a bit of a stickler about that. I want the best face. So if you, though, are still pretty new and you do have a planer and you're removing material, try to take an even amount from both sides. You're going to probably have a better time in the end. This guy, one side is better, but I think I'll still take a little more off of the opposite side just to give me a fighting chance at this staying flat, though this torrefied wood is usually pretty good. It's just super brittle and tears out. So I'm going to go do that. I'm going to go flatten one face, take a skim pass off the other side, come back the next day, and we'll go from there. Been a little over, I don't know, 18 hours. It's the next day, which is good enough for me. This has stayed flat enough. And by flat enough, I mean that when I go to make the miter cuts, I don't want it tipping or rocking at all, and ideally I don't want a huge cup in there. That's going to affect how the miters glue together and also whether there's any big gap in the middle. If you have two big cups, you end up with this kind of gap in the middle of the miter that's just kind of like this hole kind of thing that you can fill and kind of bend the fibers in, but it removes that really crisp edge. And if you have a twist as you cut through, when you go to glue the boards together, you can meet one kind of corner, but the other one won't meet perfectly, and then you've got to do some sanding, and you can finesse it later after it's glued together to get it look correctly, but it's not the easiest process. So ideally, we want it flat enough so that it's not moving at all when it goes through the miter cut, and it doesn't have a giant cup. Now my box is going to be final dimensions about 12 by 6 by 3. And the way I get that is, like I said, I build around the lid. I'm going to final thickness this later, but this piece right here is 12 by 6. And what I want is to know that at all times, this piece is bigger than the box I build so that I'm never on the wrong side of that. I never want to end up with a lid smaller than the box and I have to go find another lid somewhere. So I usually take whatever the rough dimensions are of the piece, and that's what I build the box to, because then that leaves me room to trim it off, square it up, all of that. You will always have a box that is the correct size if you start it and build it at the dimensions of the beginning of the lid. 12 by 6 means I build my box at 12 by 6. Now, if you are building a box to fit a specific size, you obviously will do your dimensions your own way to whatever you need them to be. So what's next? Well, I've got this rough piece right here, and what I need at the end of this are 2 long sections, 2 thin sections, all of the same height, and of a rough length longer than what it's going to be in the end. That way I get a couple chances at the miters in case there's any tear out on one of the first cuts. I am really not a fan of one-shotting things and that I have to get it perfect the first time. So this is about 21.5 inches. Like I said, I'm going to 12 by 6. Yeah, about 6.5 inches wide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lop off a 13-inch section of this right here in the middle. It doesn't have to be a super straight cut, but it'd be nice if it was straight. I'm then going to square up or straighten the edge that hasn't been done yet. This has been jointed on this edge nice and straight. This one now I need it to be parallel to this. I will then have a 16-inch section and then 7 or whatever the remaining is. Sorry, 13-inch section and then whatever 7 or so the remaining is, and it will have 2 parallel ends. I will then go through and rip each of those down the middle. I want them over 3 inches. I do not want to bring it down to the final 3 inches yet. And the reason I do that is because in the past, I used to keep a separate section of the same board to make the little lip out of. That's actually really handy in case you screw it up. But I've gotten better enough that I generally try to take the lip from the piece that it's going to be matched to, so you get this almost seamless kind of grain look. What that means though is we have to cut that lip out of the piece, meaning that we will be removing 1 saw kerf worth of thickness or the height. And in order to account for that, we don't want to cut it down to 3 inches yet. We want to deal with that later. Once we make that cut, we can then cut all the remaining pieces down to the 3 inches so that it all matches nicely. We will walk through that once we've cut the miters. I will explain all of that again, so don't worry if that doesn't make a whole lot of sense or it's a little confusing. We'll go through it step by step. Right now, we just need a few rough pieces. 2 of them that are over 3 inches at 13 inches long, 2 of them that are over 3 inches at whatever the remainder is. Miles from the future here, we're adding this back in. You need to decide before you do all this cutting that I've done, what part of the board is what. I usually choose the nicest, most figured part, or whatever I think the cleanest, best looking part is for the longer sides. Ideally, those are both the longer sides. It's going to be the most kind of surface area that we're visually looking at. I like to try to do some grain wrapping so at least the 2 sides match, but in a case like this, I've got this really ugly, I don't know, pitch pocket. It's something, I'm not sure what it is. So no matter which way the orientation is, that's going on the inside and it's gonna be the bottom. I don't want that seen at all. But before you cut it all up, if it is still looking something like this, make sure to mark out which way is which and then decide which area is the best one for you. So we'll go back to the future now. Now, before we go to the table saw and cut the miters, we want to do a bunch of layouts so that we know which way is which when we're going to cut, so we don't end up over there unsure which piece goes where. Now, the way I like to do this is just pre-lay it out in a square. Obviously, we'll have picked what our front side is. That's going to be front for me. And I like to go front right. So if you're facing the box, the front right will be 1. And I write the number 1 on there. I write 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4. I also write it on the bottom so that when we go to trim this to size, so that when we cut the front lip, we know which it is. We're not missing one after we cut this off and we're unsure which one is which. I like to lay all that out, number it, all of that. I also like to pre-draw, not necessarily exactly where the 45 cut's going to be. We can do that when we get to the table saw. You can do it now if you want, but exactly which way the angle is going to be so that when I'm over there at the saw, I can pick up a piece, I can see, oh, okay, the line goes that way. I know I'm putting it into the table saw that way and not like that. I'm going like that. It's much easier to do all of this now so that when you're at the table saw and you pick up a piece to cut, because we have to make 8 cuts here, we're going to be going through, moving stop blocks, all of that kind of stuff. We want to know exactly what we're doing before we get there. Now, it can be really easy to accidentally lay these out wrong. All you need to know to make sure you've got it right is that your angles should always be like this facing the outside of the box. So if you have a board like this and this is the outside, it should always look like that. Meaning that for every corner, we should always look like this. They should run parallel to each other. The 2 lines on the meeting corners, when you're just visually looking at it, should line parallel, and that means your layout is correct. The outside is correct. I also often like to just write out with an arrow and top. I will write all over these things to make sure I don't lose track of what is what. You can see here my labeling up close, 2, 3, up, out, facing this way. And then you can sort of see here my 45-degree line there, as well as over there, and then the corresponding on the other side. And this is what I mean. They will always line up like so. If you have them looking like that, one of them is labeled wrong. All right, we are at one of the crucial points, cutting the miters. This is kind of you have to make sure you know what your dimensions are going to be. You don't get to go back. You can go shorter, can't go longer. So make sure you've got your dimensions decided. Make sure you've picked which face is going out. Again, you can't undo this once you make these cuts because they are very much directional. I always do test cuts when I'm building something that I'm going to sell or is like going to be a special piece that I give to somebody, something like that. I want these to be as close to perfect as possible. I keep around some pine. I keep a fair bit of it around, and I just do test cuts, make a test box every single time. And if after those test cuts, the joints don't line up how I like, I go back, I try to get to 45 again or closer and try to get it right. On gluing 45s, I don't do splines usually. I like the look of just that clean grain. And it is unbelievably important to have the most amount of glue surface touching. That is all that is holding these together is this little bit of end grain right here. Now it can be very strong. you can boot around a mitered box and it'll stay together. But the further we get a gap there, we are immediately losing a lot of glue surface. So we want this to be pretty darn close. Do your test cuts if you can, get this right, and you'll be much happier in the end. We'll have to do minimal gap filling, etc. Always bring along some painter's tape when we're actually doing our final pieces here. I put some tape on the end. It's very easy to get tear out. Ideally, you're using a 6D tooth crosscut blade or higher. I wouldn't do these with a rip blade. You can get away with a 40 tooth, but you're gonna get, I don't know, just more tear out possibilities. We also want the cleanest cuts possible because this is a mating surface. Any kind of large saw blade marks are gonna mean we don't get as good of adhesion. So if you have a 60 tooth or higher blade, throw it on. This is definitely a time to use it. Minimizing tear out, getting the cleanest surface. I also really like to use a sled for this. This is just kind of a personal thing. I used miter gauges in the past with kind of a fence that I threw on there of MDF. I just really like, especially when I'm doing tiny pieces, to be able to have both hands on there at the same time and not be reaching kind of over like this. Totally a personal thing, but if you have some MDF or plywood laying around, I highly suggest making a dedicated miter sled if you're planning to do more than one of these. All right, I'm gonna get this all set up. We'll make these cuts. I have a full video, if I said that or not already, I'm not sure, on miters and trying to perfect them. So if you're looking for more tips on just this part, check my channel out, you'll find it there. My test cuts came out nicely, so this is just peace of mind. I know now that when I cut into this nice wood, as long as I don't screw something else up, it's gonna come out nicely, and that's awesome. Now, there's a couple ways to attack this, and specifically if you are wrapping grain, I'm not sure if these go together, but if you're wrapping grain, you want obviously to remove as little as possible from these two corners so that it matches up nicely. I like to go through with all four pieces and I make one cut on one side first, and that way I get a chance to avoid any tear out. So I pick whatever kind of area of the board I like to leave it long to start, right? I want the kind of best grain area from, and I will pick that first side. If I'm grain wrapping, it's going to be that mating edge. I make that cut. I make that cut until I get it as close to perfect as I can in terms of tear out, but I want to remove as little material as possible. I go through and I do that for all of them. Then I come back and I cut in pairs of lengthwise so that I get exactly matching lengths with stop blocks. Always use a stop blocks because the opposite sides have to be identical in length, or even if they are 45 degrees, it will not meet up with a nice square corner. It has to be the exact same length. So don't try to go through one at a time and cut each of them on a marking. Make sure to cut both of these before you move the stop block. That's my only advice here, or else you will be going to assemble it and it will not be correct and you'll be very confused. At this point, you should have all of your first side miters cut. Make sure these are as clean as possible. Once we move on and cut to the final length, like I said, we can't come back. Be happy with these now so that if there is any tear out on your final length cut, it's only one that has some tear out. At least the other side is pretty good and clean. Now, make sure, like I mentioned before also, that we are cutting these both at the same time. So do both of these before you go and do these. Do not try to move the stop block around and match it up with a line. These need to be identical. So don't move your stop block before you cut both of them. We also have to be very delicate with these. It's very easy to chip, scratch, or smush was what I'm looking for here, the ends of these miters. They are such a fine little point. Now, if we smush them, a little bit of water soaked in there can kind of pop it back out. But if you chip it off, it's not coming back. It's just going to be that way, and we have to hope a little sanding can finesse that into a better looking spot. So go through, we're just gonna cut the other sides now. And what I would suggest is if you are not dead set on a specific dimension, let's say you are building a box and you can have anywhere from 12.5 to 12. Well, I certainly suggest making your first attempt at 12.5. Does it look clean? Is it a good cut? Okay, do the other one. Does it look clean? Is it a good cut? If it is, just leave it, walk away, leave it at that length because you've got clean miters. If it is not clean, you can then take another nibble and you can go down. This is why I like to make whatever is going in after the fact. Now, I may know kind of roughly what size it is, but I like to give myself multiple chances to make the cut here. I just want to say before we make these final cuts, if you're new to mitered boxes, 6 inches, when I talk about a 6-inch sided box is the outside dimension. That is not the same as a 6-inch internal dimension. Whatever your outside is, the internal is going to be that subtracted by 2 thicknesses of your piece, 1 for each side. So if you need 6 inches internal, it needs to be 6 inches plus the thickness of your wood times 2. I just want to say that now because it's kind of confusing when you talk about a 12x6 box. The internal is not actually 12x6. That is the external dimensions. At this point, hopefully this looks all correct to you. The miters are the foundation of the rest of this box build, so take this chance to make sure they're correct, especially before you go and put the saw back to 90 degrees and totally normal. If there's anything you'd like to make another cut on, do it now. But assuming you've got these, you're happy with them, or you've gone back, done it again, and you're happy with them, we're now going to kind of get to the base and the lid portion. We're going to do the base first. Now you can either make the groove to fit something that exists like a plywood, or you can plane down solid wood, which I'm going to do, and then make the base groove fit that. I like to go between 1/4 inch and 5/16, somewhere in that middle range for the solid wood. It takes up less space, but I still get kind of a nice thickness feel out of it that feels nice and solid. I don't love using 1/4 inch plywood, but I don't want to go all the way to 1/2 inch. So somewhere between 5/16 and 1/4 inch is great. Now I have a 1/4 inch router bit, so that's kind of what I base this off of. We're going to go ahead, you can plane that down. I jointed this earlier. It's probably not flat. It's probably not going to stay flat. I'm just going to plane it down. When you get wide pieces of box store pine down to thin thicknesses, they rarely ever stay flat, so I don't freak out about it. We cut the groove a little over in thickness just in case by the time we go to glue it up, it's twisted or cupped a little bit. If you are spending multiple kind of sessions milling down your lid, I did one already earlier on this when I planed this down. I'm going to check it for flat. I'm going to probably take some more off right now, maybe go down to final thickness, maybe not, depending upon how far I get with this before the end of the evening. In the end, I like my lid to be somewhere between 5/16 and 3/8 of an inch. That gives it a nice solid feel when you pull it out. It's not too heavy. If you're using a very dense kind of African or Latin American hardwood, you may want to go on the closer to 5/16 side of that because we are going to be sliding this out, and if it's super heavy, it's a little awkward. But somewhere in there kind of just gives it a sturdy feel without being too heavy. It's almost kind of a vibes thing. I don't know if that's the right word, but that's what I like thickness-wise, 5/16 to 3/8, somewhere in the middle there. If you're making a much larger box, you probably want to go a little thicker than that. I do these on the router. You can do these on the table saw. It doesn't really matter with the miters. We can do it on either one of them. Now, once you've brought down your base and or your lid at the same time to pretty close to final thickness, before we do the layout and the groove cutting, we want to get this right before the final sanding grit. So the second to last sanding grit, if you're going to 220, maybe that's 150, 180, something like that. We want to do the fit with pretty close to the very final thickness, but then also still have a last grit to do in case we scratch it, we nick it up, something like that. We don't want to have it all the way down to size and then have it worked with throughout the project. We get to the very end and then there's a scratch in it. We have to remove more material than we'd like to. So get the base and the lid, if you're doing this at the same time, down to the final thickness and then the second to last grit. Now this is going to be the rough layout of how we're going to cut our grooves. This here is as if we were looking at the piece facing down. We're going to have a base groove at the bottom here, a lid groove at the top, and then 2 lips that hold over. Now on this top lip, I call it the lid lip. I like that to be 1/8 of an inch. I want it thicker because if somebody were to pull up on the lid, I do not want it to snap, but this base lip can be a little thinner to save us room. Somewhere between 1/16 and 3/32. I kind of like the 3/32 of an inch range. Right now we are going to do the base. I also like to go about 1/4 inch deep for both of these, though if you want to go a little deeper on the lid, you can 5/16. We also don't want to go so deep that this little thing hanging off this lip becomes flimsy and breakable. So 1/4 inch deep for the base, and then if you want to go a little deeper for the top, you can, but 1/4 inch is kind of where I like to keep things at. So we're going to go to the router, and you can do this on the table saw, and we're going to do this little groove right now. This is where the labeling really comes in handy. I know this is up and out, so I'm going to draw a line. This Inker thing, very handy. at 3/32 of an inch. And what I really want to do, if you don't have setup blocks, is carry it over the ends so that we can actually set it up by eye at the router table or the table saw. Just make sure it goes over the end. It'll obviously be hidden / removed, so it's not a big deal if it's there. And then, like I said, you've got your piece sanded down to the second to last grit. I just do this by physically putting it on there. And I usually have to go a little over to give some wiggle room. But this is kind of where I'm aiming for when I'm moving so that I don't have to test fit until I get to this realm. So for me, that's lining up pretty nicely with 15/16. And I'm just going to carry this over, same thing. We only need to do this on one piece, and the others will just get run through after. And that is my layout for the base. And we're going to do this first, and then we'll come back and do the lid. Normally I do them at the same time, but I don't want to confuse anyone, so we're going to do the base first and then the lid. When you've got done sanding your pieces to your second to last grit, you need to look at the edges. If you used a random orbit sander, and especially if you had to go through quite a few grits, you probably rounded over these edges. And that's not like detrimental or anything, but we eventually are going to cut this down to size. And what that means is that the thickness likely for where we're eventually going to cut is thicker than the rounded down edge. So you don't have to cut this to perfect final size right now, and I don't yet, but you need to trim off any rounded edges so that when we cut our grooves and we're just going to do a kind of check fit, we're not way under where we think we should be because we have these narrower rounded edges. So take a look at these, just an eyeball it. If they look rounded over, go just trim that little bit off. All right, in terms of setup here, our groove, remember, is going to be 3/32 of an inch up from the bottom. We have to cut with the bottom facing into the fence because the router bit spins towards us. And to make our groove wider, we will be pushing the fence back so that we are always cutting into wood rather than a climb cut of some sort, which just isn't ideal. Now, if you have any stop blocks, you can easily line this up, turn your router bit perpendicular to the fence. I think that's the right word, 3/32. If not, that's why we carry the line over so that we can quite literally get under there and see it. You may need a headlamp. I wear a headlamp at all times when I'm woodworking. I just don't for the video because it would just shine right in your face. But when I'm doing anything else, I always have a headlamp on. So you're just going to line this up at 3/32. Then we're going to lower this bit down quite a bit, maybe to only 1/64, give or take. And we want to make just an initial skim pass on all four of these pieces. That way we'll kind of get the initial fibers severed on the top with a very light pass. So there's not a bunch of tension on the router bit, anything like that. And that'll help prevent tear out for the later cuts. Once those top fibers are severed, nothing can really yank on them. So I always skim pass it. For every pass after that, we're going about a 1/4 inch deep. You can go somewhere 1/16 of an inch, 3/32. I wouldn't suggest hogging it out above 1/8 of an inch. If you want to push it to 1/8 of an inch, go for it. But anything above that, it gets a little sketchy. It can just tear wood out. You can have a lot of problems. And remember, it's a pretty thin piece left on the inside here. Even though it's thick enough to still have structure to it, it's still pretty thin, and we don't want that to get torn off and torn away. Now, unfortunately, for most people with bench tops, all of the dust on this is going to go straight down and under. I've built myself a dust collection system under here. I have a video on it. But if you have this table, it's not going to help a whole lot to insert your dust hose behind and open these up. It'll help, I guess, pull this against the fence a little bit. You can use a featherboard if you want, but you're going to have to clean up after this because all that dust is going straight down and under. Now, of course, you absolutely can do this on the table saw. Even if you have just an alternating tooth bevel, you can do it there. The reason I do it at the router mostly is that when you actually have a very big table saw, it gets a little awkward with these tiny pieces going through. It's, I don't know, it's less awkward to do it on a tinier router table than to do a tiny piece on a big table saw. But if you don't want to have the cleanup of this and you'd rather do it at the table saw, by all means, go ahead and do that. As we get closer to our designated line, we will begin then starting to kind of test fit. We'll just hold the board up to it. Are we close? Are we not close? And ideally what we want is for it to slide in and be able to slide back and forth. We want some breathing room in there because when we go to assemble this, we don't want it so tight that any kind of cup or twist in the base is going to be a problem. So we don't want a perfect friction fit. We actually want some breathing room. And usually as long as you can slide the piece along, and I'll show you, that's a perfect spacing and you're good to go. Do not move this back until you've got full depth hit on every piece at the same spot. We need them all to line up. It's very important. All right, we've gone all the way up to 1/4 inch deep. We've got our first pass done. That is now set the bottom boundary of the base. So now we are simply going to go up to fit our base piece. Now, if you're using 1/4 inch plywood and a 1/4 inch bit, you are done at this point. But for anyone using anything thicker and a router bit smaller than that, we're going to inch our way up. Now, earlier on, we made kind of a layout line just to gauge where we're at here. Double check by just kind of bracing this up against the bottom of your cut, seeing where you're at. And remember, we do not want a perfect fit. We want a little breathing room here, you know, 32nd and a half. What is that, 3/64, something like that, 2/30 seconds. Was that 16th? Something like that. We want some breathing room in case this thing cups or twists while we're going, before we're going to glue it up and it becomes a problem. So from this point on, just to eyeball, I just start moving it a little bit at a time until I hit up on that line. I mean, I try to get it close eyeballed, but try to get it there. I don't try to measure with setup blocks or anything like that. I just try to go by fit and feel until I get a nice fit in there. And once I've got it, I will show you what I mean by sliding through and how easily it should slide through to know you've got it correct. And if I didn't mention this earlier, we are not going back down in height. Now, you could if you've got a way to make sure it gets to exactly the same height. So if you've got a nice router table insert thing here that has a way to set the depth, cool, you can go back down. But there really is no huge problem with taking little bits with a 1/4 inch deep height. I've done it a million times and it works out pretty well, and it ensures your base is always the same. If you believe you've got the correct thickness, width, whatever you want to call that for your groove, this is how we're going to check it. We're going to first take the length side of our base and the length side of our box wall, I guess I'll call it that. We want to make sure it can slide nicely. We'll want to be able to see a little bit of gap room in there. Think of like a dime, the currency a dime if you're American, and then cut it in half, like down as if you're slicing dime salamis. Something like that, maybe 4 computer paper pieces stacked, a little gap, and we want to see it the entire way. If we've got anything hitting on one side, that means we've got some kind of twist in here, and we may need to add a little more or sand this down a little more. If that looks good on the long piece, grab an end piece. And this is probably our biggest question mark here. If you've got any kind of cup in this or twist in this, especially if you're using like Home Depot pine or cheap plywood, you need to make sure it can go in this end here. A cup can make it very difficult because it will hit in the top here and then be low on the side. So you've got to test this now to make sure it fits. It should slide. It may not be quite as loose if you have a cup or a twist, but as long as we can see a little gap in there, we're good to go. Now, the biggest thing we need to make sure is that if we have a twist of some sort, and we need to make sure, and we will test this when we cut this to size, just to double check to really make sure, because we can always kind of finesse sand it if we need. But what we really want to avoid is any kind of like torquing tension when we go to glue this together. Because personally, my method, I don't use any kind of clamp. I just use tape to hold it together. And if this is torquing up and down on one side, it's going to put a lot of pressure on that tape as a clamp, and we don't want that. We want the tape to just be squeezing in. We want this guy to just be relaxing in the bottom. He's just laying in a groove. He's doing fine. He's got a little glue in the middle, pinning him in there so he doesn't fall all over the place and make a bunch of noise. But we don't want him stressing out. We don't want him hitting all over on the sides and causing us problems. So we want some breathing room in there. I just want to show you really quick what an unfinished gap would look like if you are still working on yours and haven't already walked away from it. I'm building another piece here to hold receipts because I still buy stuff in cash and get paper receipts. But anyways, I have not finished fully doing this groove, and this is what it looks like with a cup, when you haven't cut it properly and deep enough. We've got a gap here and a gap here, but because this is cupping this way, we're making contact here, and then we are making contact back on this corner, but not here, and then we're making contact again here. Now that's problematic because it means that when we go to put this base in, it's wanting to kind of bend it, and we don't want that. That's going to cause some pressure when we go to glue up. It's going to be not a good time. You're not going to have a good time. If you French fry instead of pizza, you're not going to have a good time. So this would be a gap that needs to be widened. It's not thick enough yet. I want to be able to see a gap on all of the pressure points. You can see it doesn't slide easily. That's how a good way to tell. It's just a tight, stuck fit. Now is the point where we're going to shave the lid off, or rather trim the lid off and then shave the box down before we then do the lid groove. This is a bit of an aesthetic choice as to how thick you want to make the piece that you pull the lid out from. On a box this size, and on most of my boxes, I like to go somewhere between 3/4 and 7/8. On a much bigger box, I can go up all the way to 1 inch sometimes. Obviously, the bigger the lid, the heavier it gets. So maybe the more kind of pull you want on it. For tiny little boxes, I'll go all the way down to like a 1/2 inch or 5/8, but then you need a much thinner lid to slide in there. Really what we're looking for here is to have enough room so that we can cut a groove for our lid to go into and then also to pull on. I have a few examples here from past boxes. This is 1 inch, this is 3/4 of an inch, and 7/8 of an inch. Now for reference, this is going to be down to about a 3-inch box, right? So that would be roughly what 7/8 is going to be, and that's what I'm going to do, about 7/8. This is what 3/4 would be. It gets a little slimmer looking. And then if you wanted to go a whole inch, that's going to be quite thick. You can see how much will be left versus how much will be the lid lip. So for me, like I said, I want to do about 7/8 of an inch. And what that means is I like to cut the lid lip as the outside of the blade. So I want to leave 7/8 of an inch to the left of the blade. And then whatever size your box is, you just will cut the rest off on the inside. I don't know why, I just like having the smaller piece being the off cut here. I think it works a little better, leaves a little bit of a cleaner cut. Now the reason we do this before the lid groove is that if you were to not get the cleanest cut, you may want to shave a little more off. Then we will then have to shave a little more off of this guy. We're already ideally going to be taking just a single kerf off of this so that they then match. And we will then reference the thickness of that little lip based on the new height. If we were to do it ahead of time, we'd have to kind of predict what our removal amount is. And if you were to get a bad cut, maybe some tear out or a lot of saw marks or something, you may want to remove a little more. But then all of a sudden you're thinning down your lips. So we do this afterwards in an ideal world. My only suggestions here are that you cut with the bevels facing down, so the most reference surface, and then you put some tape over this whole cut line. I usually don't have any problems with tear out. It usually goes pretty smoothly, but you really don't want to be taking a chunk out of something because it will not blend in if we're missing something. This is kind of another point of no return based on how this cut goes. It's going to either go well or you're going to have to retrim and make your box smaller and smaller and smaller until it looks better. All right, that went super well for me. I'm extremely happy with that cut. It doesn't always go perfectly, and sometimes you have to shave a little bit off. We're now going to attempt to just remove a single kerf width of this. However, we can manipulate everything here with some sandpaper at the end. So if this ends up a little taller by, just a hair or so, well, we're gonna have to sand some saw blade marks off of here almost certainly anyways, or pencil marks. If it ends up a little shorter, then we can always do a little sanding on the lid lip, which we're gonna do anyways to get any marks out of there. Try to take a kerf out, exactly a kerf. If you're a little over, a little under, not the biggest problem in the world. Again, tape this up. We do not want any tear out at this point. It can be really unfortunate. And I always suggest putting the bevel down. You don't want to have the saw blade just ripping through with nothing behind. That is a perfect way to get tear out. All right, it's time to do the lid groove. This is pretty similar to the base groove, but with one key difference, and that being, we obviously only need the two sides, the back and the lid here, but we want, in my opinion, to have a slightly thicker lip right here. This shows 3/32 on the base. Now, the thing about that is there's never gonna really be much tension on any small part of that, so it can be a little thinner. On the top lip groove here, this kind of part right here, I usually go 1/8 of an inch, unless it's a delicate kind of tiny box. And my thinking there is that if someone is opening it over and over, and every single time they're sort of lifting up before they get all the way out, they're gonna be putting pressure on that little lip right there. And it's kind of fragile at the very end there. At about 1/8 of an inch, it feels pretty strong when you couldn't really break it with your fingers unless you really crunched on it. Obviously, a 3/32 is kind of my minimum for this one here, which is what we did on the base. You can go thinner than that, you can try that. Just be warned that it could snap off if there's something heavy in the box and someone were to pull and lift. Again, I like to do about a 1/4 inch deep here because it then doesn't leave this huge kind of floppy, thin, long part that's even easier to break off. There's less kind of torque that can be applied to it, whatever you want to call leverage. That's what I'm looking for. And again, at the end here, we simply want to make sure if we have some kind of cup at all in this lid, that it can slide through there. That means we'll be able to clear when we put the box in there. We do not want this to be a friction fit, or you're gonna have a rough time getting it in and out easily. Even once we make sure this clears, later on we will put a bit of a round over on this so that if there's any seasonal change, it still kind of ramps itself up and in there, and you never notice that it may actually have technically hit something. It just slides in. This is the gap level and slide motion we are looking for here. I have a slight cup in this lid, but I am making almost no contact on top in the peak of that cup, which allows me to still slide. That's what I want. And there you can see kind of the gap amount I'm talking about. It's relatively thin, but it's still there. If we try to hold this at 90 degrees, you can see that is the gap point I'm talking about. So I want to do a quick check-in at about what I would call the halfway, little over halfway point to make sure we are at the same spot if you're following along. Our back and two sides all have the lid and base groove, and they are cut to final width, thickness, and length. Our front piece has been split to create our pull lip that we're going to use, and we have the base groove inside of this. These pieces, other than a sanding of the inside before gluing together, are essentially done for now. We also now have our lid and our base, which have been taken down really close to final thickness and then sanded to the second to last grit. That leaves us really darn close. Now we're going to set aside this lid, the top of the lid, yes, the lid, for now, that we deal with the dimensioning of that in terms of length and width after it's glued together. It's much easier to get a better fit once we can just slide it in and out to check. We have to do the base now because obviously this has to go in before it is glued up. Now, personally, I'm going to be staining this, so I'm going to stain it, then I'll come back the day after, something like that, and glue this together. But the big thing we have to think about here is any expansion and contraction. And this is going to depend a little bit on the size of your box. I'm right on the kind of the edge of having to be a little concerned in that there's going to be about 5 inches of width of my base here, or at least room for it. Now, what that means is I want to leave about 1/8 of an inch total, maybe a little under that, of breathing room on either side so that this can expand and contract. If you're making a very narrow box, maybe it's just to hold like a single pen or something, you don't want to make this tight. You don't want to have it pressing on any sides or two opposing sides at the same time, but you don't have to worry anywhere near as much about expansion and contraction going across the width because it's going to be such a small amount given the percentage over a tiny distance. But for me, in an outdoor shop in the Midwest with about 5 inches of room in here, I now have to leave about 1/16 of an inch on either side. Now, 1/8 of an inch total. So I don't have to like trim 1/16 and 1/16. I just need to get this to equal this groove and then remove about maybe a little under 1/8 of an inch. And I do all the measuring here just by straight up placing it in there, marking it off. I then cut it exact, and then I simply remove 1/8 of an inch from there. And like I said, I'm at about 5 inches. As you go down smaller, you can take off less and less. Now, we also are going to be leaving it a little short, but not a whole 1/8 of an inch lengthwise, maybe 1/16 or less kind of. Still want some breathing room going long ways here, but it doesn't have to be as much because we expand and contract much more this way. We will also be pinning it in the dead middle here with some glue just to kind of keep it from rattling around. It'll still be able to expand and contract out to either side, but a little bit of glue here and a little bit of glue here will keep it generally held down to the lip. So I'm going to go ahead and get this cut. Like I said, there's no real reason to get the tape measure out. Just stick it in there, make a mark, and cut it. And after that, we will then do kind of a test glue up. We're not actually going to glue it up, but we're going to fold it all up and make sure it fits together well. We will then sand the inside. I much prefer to do the inside sanding now, and if you are using any kind of finish that's a hard finish, you're also going to need to spray it or paint it on in terms of like a polyurethane before this is glued up. In terms of width, that is the amount of gap I am leaving total. The other side is flush, so you can see about 1/8 of an inch. Conversely, in terms of the length, I've left much less than that. I don't know, little under a 1/16, give or take, something like that. So those are the two gap amounts that I've left to allow for any kind of movement whatsoever. With your lid now cut down to size, we're going to do a test glue up, I'll call it like that. We're gonna put the tape on there, we're gonna fold it up, we're gonna make sure it fits, we're gonna listen to make sure there's a little breathing room for the lid in there, and then we'll know for sure that when we actually go to glue it up, everything's gonna fit well. I have had times where I've gone to glue it up and I forgot to shave this to the correct size, and I'm sitting there trying to close the thing. It's just not closing, and then I realize I don't have the base cut, and I have to run to the table saw, which is 24 inches away, quickly cut it. The glue is starting to dry. I'm running back 24 inches or so, sticking it in there. Does it fit? It's total panic station. So we want this to go together well right now when we don't have any glue in there. All right, the test fitting went really well. The miters look great, the base fits. And I want you to hear, I'm gonna be moving it back and forth this way. It's not much, but it's a little bit of movement. That's that 1/8 of an inch or so. And then this will be going forward and backwards. It's much less movement. And that's what I'm looking for right here. And like I said, we're gonna put some glue in there and there to actually keep it from just kind of rattling back and forth. But if you just let it sit and you didn't glue it, it'd be totally fine too. It's just if you carried it around, you might hear that. Okay, I have to decide if I'm gonna stain. I'm so torn right now. It looks so cool, but I'm gonna do that. We'll come back tomorrow, or rather I'll come back tomorrow and we'll get on from there. We'll glue this thing up. Now, before we glue this up, we have to sand and possibly finish the inside. If you're going to do some kind of spraying, trying to spray afterwards is a total mess. If you're going to spray it all, do it now. Big key with sanding is we don't want to remove a bunch of material from one and not from the other. In order for these to glue up and look pretty good on the top, we need these corners here to meet. If you start taking a bunch off of one, it doesn't line up correctly and it will just kind of look bad. You'll have less glue surface, etc. At minimum, you should avoid taking a ton of material away from this edge, and ideally we avoid rounding it over a bunch. So a round over is not the biggest problem as long as you don't remove a ton of material from the edge and not from the middle. I like to do most of this either hand sanding and kind of feathering, or with even better, a sanding block that's going to keep it flat throughout. And I also like to go both ways and count my kind of strokes, I guess we'll call them, to ensure I don't remove too much from one piece and not the other. If you're doing a very tiny box, I definitely suggest these because it gets really hard to keep this flat even by hand if it's very tiny, like a pen case or something like that. We don't have to be perfect on the inside. We just want to get rid of any tear out, any kind of planer marks, anything like that. For the most part, when somebody opens a box, they're not meticulously inspecting the inside. We just don't want any obvious kind of marks or mars or anything when someone looks inside of there. So take your time here. Don't remove a ton of material. Don't go random orbit sandering this thing like crazy. Most random orbit sanders have a soft pad on the bottom. And if the box width is smaller than that, if you place it over, it'll kind of envelop the whole thing and it will start rounding all of this over. I only use the random orbit sander on my, what would that be, third to last. I go from 150, 220, 320, that's where I use the random orbit sander, 400, a little finish by sand and then by hand, and then quadruple that steel wool to get that kind of shiny look on the interior. And that final random orbit sanding before I move up to 400 is just very light. I'm almost holding the random orbit sander up. I'm not letting much pressure at all push down on there, or else you very quickly will round this over and it won't look quite as crisp. One thing I want to touch on here is you may be tempted at some point to take your front piece and sand any saw marks off of this. And if you do that, do not touch this outside edge here. When we cut that off, the table saw blade, if it wasn't at perfectly 90 degrees, it's still going to equal out from the other piece because we're simply inserting it right back on top. If you hit the outside edge of this and either round it over or change the angle, there's going to be a noticeable gap. It's already hard enough to deal with getting that gap to go away when we push the lid in due to balancing everything. If you start taking material off of there or rounding it over, good luck. It's never going to happen. So if you wish to sand any blade marks off of this, stay away from this outside edge. It doesn't matter what you do to the inside as much. Just make sure maybe the first, I don't know, let's say 1/8 of an inch back from that outside edge remains untouched. The glue up process is pretty simple. We're going to lay our pieces out. I prefer to have all of the bottom pieces facing towards the straight edge. We align them, and we're going to take tape, painter's tape preferably, but you could use probably duct tape. It would just take some sanding to get the stickiness off. And we are going to pull it quite taut on there, and we're going to, don't skimp on the tape. This is our entire clamping mechanism, unless you are using mitered clamps. So get that nice and taut, and just make sure that whole joint almost is covered. I have waffled throughout the years between frog tape and this blue tape. One time I had what seemed to be some kind of bluish dark residue left on a very white maple box, and that kind of scared me. I moved to this. This is stickier and stretches a little better. This can be problematic if there's dust over this. It just quite literally won't stick. But whenever I'm doing a very light colored box, I go back to this. If it's dark, I just stick with this because I like everything else about it better. I've never had that problem again, but it really scared me that one time because I had to stain the entire box because I just couldn't get it out of there. It was like sunk into the pores, the grains. It was a total mess. Once you have applied all of your tape across, don't forget to put one on the very end piece because we're going to be folding this up onto itself. We can get rid of this guy. Oof. And then we're just going to flip this over. Now, if it kind of like wobbles apart, you didn't put enough tape on there. Go back, start over, and put more tape on there. It should be able to flip over without these pieces coming out of alignment. I also like to kind of soak the end grain with, I don't know, let's say 3-to-1 glue to water. I paint it on there. Be very careful not to let it bleed over to the inside, or conversely the outside. Since it does soak into the pores, it can be a real pain to get out, and it will block an oil finish from sinking in there. So don't get it too close to the edges, just keep it in the middle. The idea here is that if we just apply a bunch of normal glue, you can quite literally watch it disappear, and if you were to close it before it's all sunk in and not reapplied more, there'd be very little glue on the surface to make contact. So I pre-paint on this watered down solution to, in theory, kind of clog some of the pores up so that only the top is open, and when we apply our regular glue, the two mating surfaces have the right amount of glue connecting. Now, I've had people say, people have been doing miters for decades, I don't know, 100, 200 years, whatever, didn't do this before. That's fine. You do it how you want to do it. This has always worked for me, so I'm going to continue doing it that way. It just makes it's peace of mind for me. When it comes to applying the regular thick glue, if you apply too much and you fold it up, it will squeeze it onto the inside. So make sure you kind of feather the amount so that before you close it, there's a little more kind of down in there in the crevice in the middle, and not a big glob sitting at the kind of top edge, because it will just squeeze it right out, and then you got to clean it out of there. It's a total mess. Some people also like to paint the water glue solution on and let it like fully dry for an hour. I paint it on, and then maybe a minute or two later, I then go and do normal glue. I don't wait for it to totally harden and dry. If you're using any kind of exotic Latin American, African lumber that has a silica, that oily kind of content, you should wipe down these glue surfaces ahead of time with mineral spirits to try to remove that from the top. That has been known to kind of block glue from going in, which can be good in the sense that we want to block some, but we don't want to block it all. You should always wipe it down with mineral spirits. Ideally, you have some compressed air and you can just blow it off so it dries, and then immediately apply your glue. And the only other warning I have is that since we have this smaller part in front, kind of make note of where that goes on these other ends so that you're not painting glue above it, or else any kind of oil finish won't sink in later. So just take a pencil and just kind of draw a rough line across there, and don't paint your glue above that. Once you've gone through and applied this to each of them, go back to the beginning, and if it has essentially all disappeared, put a little more on there. We don't want it like watery on the surface, but we don't want it all just gone either, because that means we're going too deep, as in we still need a little more to help fill up pores. You can quite literally in real time watch it disappear. So go back and apply a little more if it looks like you didn't apply any at all. We want just a little bit dark coloring. That tells us we've got enough in there before we apply the regular glue. This is what it looks like when it all starts to disappear. We want it in the end to actually look more like this one on the left here before we apply the regular glue. I have to come back and reapply to this one. Now, once you believe you've properly kind of soaked that grain a little bit, we're gonna go with just normal glue. Now, explaining how much is the right amount is a little hard, and this is kind of an experience and trial and error thing. you can always go back and put on a second layer before you close it up. So err on the side of a kind of modest amount. We don't want giant globs, but we also do want glue to be seen on the surface before we close it up. So put a modest amount on, and by the time you work your way down to the end, go back and look. If there's not really much glue on the surface, apply a little more. I'll try to come in with the camera and show you one that I would consider the appropriate amount of glue. And always err on the side of painting some everywhere, but if you're going to have kind of any kind of globbiness, it's closer to the middle or inside of the joint so that when it closes, it doesn't all just get squeezed into the inside of the box. Here is what not enough looks like. This has sunk back in up top here. This is what I want to see right here. I want to see glue. You can see I've not put a ton towards the top here, and I'm going to drag some of that down. I want to see glue. I need to add a little bit more to the top here, but I've got it most places and it hasn't sunk away. This one's good too, but I got to come back to this first one over here and reapply somewhere it's sunk in. Once you feel comfortable with the amount of glue you have on there, we have to place glue in the middle of the two end pieces. We are again pinning this area and this area in so that it doesn't shake, rattle, and roll. So just put a little over maybe a 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch kind of section in the middle there so that it ideally glues down, but we still have wiggle room for the sides of expansion. At this point, we're ready to go and just fold this guy up and get it glued together. Now, one thing you may notice is that it may look like they're not fully closing all the way. We've swelled up that end grain quite a bit. So if you are trusting that your joints are cut correctly, it's pretty likely that it may not close until it dries a little bit and it'll pull itself together. Obviously, we won't know for sure until we take the tape off, but just be warned that sometimes they're a little swollen and it doesn't look like it's fully closing correctly. You may have also just not cut your miters well. One of the two possibilities. Take a peek inside. If you've got any glue kind of overspill in there, you can clean it up now, or you can wait till later and get it out with a chisel. We'll come back after 24 hours and see how this looks. I definitely suggest giving it 24 hours. This is a joint that we want fully dried before we work on it anymore. It's been about 24 hours, and this is kind of the moment of truth where we find out how good were our miters, how good was our glue up. We take this tape off and we're gonna see. It's pretty good. I'm pretty freaking happy with that, to be honest. You never know. Sometimes it just doesn't glue up as straight as you like. Sometimes it's perfect. I've made probably 80, 90, I don't know, maybe even 100 mitered boxes. And to this day, I never go into it being like, I guarantee this is gonna work. I've only probably lost one of them in terms of it just not gluing up well enough at all to use or sell. So I don't have any gaps to fill. Obviously, we're gonna do a little sanding just to kind of smooth this out and shape it and everything like that, get all this excess glue off of there. But otherwise, there's not much really here that needs to be fixed. So I will talk a little bit about filling gaps should you need to do that. Now, before I do some rough sanding, I just wanted to let you take a look at it so you don't have to take my word for it. Pretty happy with that guy. Got some glue to clean up along the edge here. I notice I've got a little bit of chipping here, whether that was from the saw that I didn't notice or sometime after when I banged it on something. But that joint's looking pretty tight. Pretty tight on all of these. I'm extremely pleased. Obviously, it's extremely banged up and rough because I'm not the most gentle in the world to it, but I'm very, very happy with this. Also make sure right at this point to check either of these areas for any glue spill out because we will need to clean that off so that the lid will fit in correctly. Now that we've got this glued up and we're happy with the miters, we're gonna do some kind of rough shaping, sanding work. If at this point it is not sitting flat, it's twisting at all, that can sometimes happen from when you're pulling the tape really taut. If the glue is still kind of a little wet, it can shift the sides a little bit and you'll get almost like a twist that you'd have in a board. This can also happen if the lid didn't have enough breathing room and it was pushing up or down on one side or the other. We're gonna flatten the bottom of this now if it needs to be done. Find some kind of reference surface, usually a table saw top is pretty good for that. If the box is smaller than a sheet of sandpaper, gluing like 150 down to some MDF and running it over works really well. If it is bigger than this, be very careful if you do this, that when you go over the side, you don't go down at all. It will hollow out this kind of middle section and it may sit flat, but you'll look at it from the side and it'll have kind of like a weird hollowed out shadow. You can also take some sanding blocks that are wider than the actual box itself and just kind of hit the ends of this going back and forth just very delicately. bringing it down there. You can also just kind of put it on the surface, identify which is high, and just go at it by hand, but just go very slowly. We also don't want to round over the bottom here and have a weird kind of shadowy bottom like that. Once you've done that, we're going to do the rough sanding here. Now for me, I go all the way up to 400 and quadruple aught steel wool grit. Now most people don't do that. So for me, 150 and 200 are my rough kind of shaping grits. I like to straight up clamp this guy down and have some 150 and 200 on MDF blocks, and I go over it like that. I do not hit this with a random orbit sander until a few light little passes towards the very end when we're doing our final sanding. You can very quickly round this thing over and round all of these edges over, and it's very hard to come back from that. I personally think the aesthetic is a little nicer when everything is nice and crisp and flat and 90 degrees to all surfaces and taut. But if you're in a hurry and you got to hit it with 150, 200, whatever on the random orbit sander, just hold it almost over, just almost hover over it, or get a hard pad for your sander. I also suggest that when you're clamping it down, use some kind of softer wood to place on the inside for your clamp so that you don't leave big clamping marks on the inside, since we already pre-sanded that. And yes, I would suggest clamping this down when you're doing it. It's very easy to tip these things over on the side. I've lost a box before having it just fall right over onto the ground when I'm sanding. You don't have to worry a ton about the top right now, though you can kind of rough remove any table saw marks that are on there. At the very end, when we've made the front lip, we will make sure that all is smooth and flat looking. A lot of what I think about building these boxes, the way I think about it is that it doesn't have to be perfect as if we were to take some kind of measuring instruments and check it. It has to function and it has to look sort of like it's perfect. So that can mean maybe one side's like a hair a little shorter because we had to adjust something out with some sandpaper, but to the human eye, it looks like it's level and it looks like it's straight and it functions correctly. It looks like it's good. That's really what I'm looking for here. I don't need it to be mathematically measurably perfect. I just need it to look pretty darn close to perfect and function like a good box does. One small tip is that when you go to sand this backside, and if you're doing it like me, you're standing this up, grab your little front lip piece and just, well, it'll be facing this way for me, but place it down in there and then clamp onto that so that you're not damaging these front parts right here. You got to be careful with these front parts. You can chip them, round them over, anything like that. So don't be afraid to use this as kind of a brace, because we know it fits perfectly in there because it was cut right off of that piece. I want to touch quickly on filling gaps. Now, the time I like to do it is during the rough sanding. I've done the 150. I'm starting 220. I'm in maybe the middle of the 220. I've got a nice amount of 220 dust kind of built up over here, maybe some on the bench I can use. I like to use Gorilla wood glue, mainly because it does as little kind of darkening of sawdust as any glue I've tried. The Tite Bonds will darken especially lighter maple kind of whitish sawdust. The Gorilla wood glue does not seem to do that, which is preferable. We're trying to make this disappear. What happens often if the gap is too big is you'll fill it with glue, you'll fill it with sawdust, you'll apply a finish on there, and it's just noticeably darker. You can see this demarcation line where the grain does not continue. What we want is for it to totally disappear. Now, ideally, the easiest gaps to make disappear are like a 64th or under, maybe a little over that. And all we're doing is putting glue and sawdust in there, but I prefer to do it quite strategically. Some people just wipe glue over this entire thing and then just sawdust everywhere. I'd much rather take a pick, put some glue on a Gatorade lid, and then just delicately apply it. Well, it'll be more like this because we've got our sawdust on here. Delicately apply it, and I take one finger and I press and I pull. What I'm looking for is whether that glue disappears down in there. I want to know so I can apply more glue before I apply the sawdust. What's really annoying is when you apply the glue, you apply the sawdust, but you didn't check to see if it goes away. You'll come back another day later, it will have sunk in there. We want to apply enough glue to block that hole up. Then we've got this sawdust all over here. We just take our sanding block and we just start pulling it into the gap. Now the key here to keep that joint at that tight kind of miter look is to come from the other side as well. We make sure we go both sides. This will keep that gap nice and kind of invisible because we're also blending it in at 90 degrees. Now, if your gap is bigger than a 64th or especially verging on a 32nd or more, you may have to use the burnishing trick. And the concept there is that we've got a gap, but we've still got two sharp edges. We can just gently roll these over into each other. We apply the glue, we apply the sawdust in there, and then we come with the screwdriver shaft often, and we just roll it through there. We're being very delicate and deliberate. We do not want to break these fibers. We just want to curl those ends in there so they meet. Go a couple times from one direction, flip it over a couple times from another. That glue and sawdust that's in there should help hold it together when it dries, and any remaining little gaps should be invisible due to the sawdust. I prefer to avoid this. I think it's noticeable, and if I have to do this, I usually take a sanding block and lightly round over all of the other edges so that it doesn't stick out. I think it's quite noticeable when one has been rolled over and all of the other ones are at a perfect nice 90 degrees. But if that's what it takes to close the gap, then that's what you got to do. It's up to you how you want to do it, but that's how I like to do it. Anything bigger than a 32nd of an inch probably, or a little more, it's going to be hard. You're going to struggle to roll that over even because the wood can only go so far. And at that point, you're probably just going to have to live with it not looking great. Or if it's gigantic, some people take a slice of wood and glue it in there, which more power to you. I would worry about problems with the structural integrity of the joint in general if your gap is that big, but you can do that if you want. Ideally, all we have to do is some glue, some sawdust, and some sanding to maintain that right angle. So just make sure you do that in the middle of your 220 sanding so that as you finish up, you will continue to pack it with any extra sawdust as well as keeping it at 90 degrees. It's time to move on to making the lid. And there are three things we have to do early on here for the rest of this to go well. The first is make sure after you've done your rough sanding that you got the saw marks off of the top. Just double check. And we want to make sure we're very careful not to destroy these edges on the end here. And the reason this is important is that when we go to put our little guy in here, we want to know we're roughly close to the finished height and that only some detail kind of finish sanding later to smooth everything out will need to be done. Second, you're going to want to make sure your lip is pretty darn close to level with the two of these. Just do that ahead of time, and also make sure to mark which side is up. It can be very easy to get lost here, even though they match. If you've got a very straight grained wood, it can be very easy to forget which side goes up. So make sure to mark it up or mark it down, whichever you want to do. And then the first thing we're going to do is trim our lid down to width, but we're not going to trim it to length quite yet because we have some determinations to make on how long it is in relation to how deep it's going into the lid. Now I have a whole video on specifically making these lids for these. That's extremely detailed. I'm going to try to hit the important parts here, but if you're still a little lost or you want a little more, check out my channel. It's a long vid on making just the lid for a sliding lid box. Now, when it comes to cutting this down for width, this cannot and should not be a perfect fit. We do not want it to be tight in there. It's got to have some wiggle room. And especially if you are making this in the winter or spring, which I am, and it's dry, this thing is going to expand in the summer. Now, there are charts online for calculating expansion, but if you're at anything over 4 to 5 inches or going way up, you absolutely have to take this into account. If you're at along the 4 to 5 inches line, you can probably get away with leaving an 1/8 of an inch extra, so 1/16 of an inch gap on either side. It starts going up more from there as expansion is a percentage, so a 9-inch at a 10% expansion or whatever it is a lot more than a 10% at 3 inches. At 3 inches, we're gonna, leave a 1/16 of an inch, something like that. If you're making a very small, thin pen case, it doesn't have to be a whole 1/8 of an inch. But once I get this cut, I will show you up close how much movement I want here. And it's best to sneak up on this. And the reason we cut it now is quite literally so we can just kind of hold it up there and make a mark and that we're sure that we did not undercut this. I'm in the process of fitting my lid, and I want to start by showing you what is too tight. Now remember, this is about 5 inches across, give or take, and so we have to leave about an 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little under, a little over for breathing room. This is too tight. I can move it a little bit, but in the summer, if you're building this in the winter, that will expand and it will quite literally get trapped in there. This is the Goldilocks zone of what I would consider just right. We've got about an 1/8 of an inch, give or take, right in that gap when I pull it all the way to this side, leaving me a little room. And you make sure the thing slides the same amount at the back as well as the front. Sometimes you'll get a little glue that may be spilled over in there, so double check on the inside of your lid groove here that there's no dry glue preventing you. And this allows us to get a nice slide, and when in the summer humidity hits, it will not get stuck. Ideally, I have in the past had times where I've had to come back in the summer and trim down a box just a little bit. We now have to determine the length of this. The first thing to make sure is that you've got it slid all the way in the back there. It's all the way in the back, so we know that it's fully pressed up. And this is all about how deep our groove is going to go into this front piece. My thickness here is about 7/8 of an inch. So I'm going to go probably 7/16 to a whole half of an inch in there, maybe 7/16 probably. If your piece is much thinner, if you're building a delicate little box, sometimes you can only get 1/4 inch in there. Whatever you can get in there, more is better, but obviously we don't want to leave so little that this thing will like possibly crack or bend or anything. And then we are going to cut off an amount to leave us with that plus about 1/8 of an inch hangover. It's much easier to do the fitting when you've got a little extra, and then we trim to final length at the end. So you put your ruler right up against the kind of edge of this box here, as that's where the back of this will hit and the start of the groove will be. So we're right up against this edge. We're going to go out, choose obviously whichever end you're cutting from. I like to remove this end a little more. There's a little less figure. I'm going to go 7/16, but then I'm going to add that 1/8 of an inch or so on there. And I'm going to cut here and shave off this in front of it here. Just trust me, for fitting the lid lip, it's better to have it a little over to start. It just makes it easier to kind of check it on and off. Now, cutting our lid groove is all about dealing with the challenges of what the wood is giving us. If your board is nice and flat, this is going to be super simple. Just cutting a groove, it's going to perfectly fit. Wonderful. Now, most boards, however, do not love to participate in such a friendly way, and we have some sort of cup or some sort of twist. Now, I have a cup up on the face side I'd like to use. If you have a cup, then just choose whatever face of the board you'd like to have facing up. The problem remains the same no matter which way you go. It's just the inverse. If you've got a twist, we've got a bigger problem here. And really what we're looking to do is try to maximize glue surface inside of what will otherwise be a straight groove. Now that requires two things. Cutting a groove that's going to fit the entirety of the, so in my case, cup. I need to account for both these bottom wings that are going to be lower and this top little part here. This is a cupping up that's going to be higher. My groove would love to be just straight across, and it will be, but in terms of the thickness of the groove, we have to account for the one high spot and the two low spots, or conversely, the one low spot and the two high spots. Now with the twist, you have to account for one high spot, one low spot, but these can be quite divergent. And this is why if you've got a really badly twisted board, it's just not going to work. It's not going to have enough glue surface to be stable. But if you want, you can pin it in there with the dowel afterwards. That's the only way to save a really twisted board as a lid, but it's going to cause you other problems just in terms of smoothly getting it in and out. But if you are hell-bent on getting a twisted board as your lid, you almost certainly afterwards will have to come from the bottom and pin it in with the dowel. Now you can do that with any of these, but it's less necessary. Now what we'd like to do here is minimize either the low spots or the high spots. And that can be done with a little bit of finesse sanding and the right groove size, the right groove width. So if you were going cup up, I often find it's easier to deal with these two low spots and just kind of a little bit of hand sanding along the edges of the board. So cup up this way. So I'm talking just taking off these little edges right here with some hand sanding so that we get something closer to flat. If you want to also try to knock off maybe down the middle along the top here, you want to just get it so that we're getting more contact for the glue surface. And this determines the width of our groove, because instead of being able to make the groove the thickness of the wood, we have to make it the thickness of the difference between the high spot and the low spot. So there's going to be some little bit of gap here and some little bit of gap on the corners here. But if we can maximize the amount of glue surface this area, and this area, will be just fine. I've made a lot of these with cupped boards. I've never had a lid come out, come loose, anything like that. I've never pinned a cup board. I've thought about it a few times. I've sold a lot of these. I've never had anyone call and say it came out, or emailed, I guess would be more likely. So with a cup, it can definitely be done without a pin, as long as you do just a little bit of gentle sanding at those spots to increase the glue surface. And if it's a tight enough fit, the friction fit's also going to help. I've also done plenty of twists. I usually don't sell those ones just because there's problematic getting it in and out. But anytime I have twisted wood and it looks nice, I use that for something I'm making for myself. But I've definitely made plenty with a twist. I want to explain all of this before we get to cutting so you can visualize it in your mind as you're going. It helps a lot more to know the end we're looking for ahead of time. So we're going to talk about a few things here. One, when I refer to the lid groove, I am referring to this area in here, and we will be looking at it from the side. When I refer to the lid lip, I am referring to this front piece part here, and we will be looking at it from the side, so it will be represented as a square. Now, you normally might think, if this long part is your groove and this is your lip, that you would want your groove to be directly across. Well, that can be problematic, and it loves to kind of lift the lip at all if you are not perfect. Especially if you have any expansion in the summer and it kind of is cupped a little bit, it'll lift it and you'll get a gap where the lip should be. I like to not have that gap. I think it looks just a touch more professional to have no gap, to the point almost where you can be confused about which side to open it up on. So the easiest way to make that gap disappear is to use gravity. And instead of cutting our groove in the lip directly across, we want to raise it by, I don't know, 128th of an inch, somewhere between that and a 64th, a little under a 64th or about a 64th of an inch on both the top and the bottom. And by raising it, we actually get our lid to sit, this is exaggerated, at a bit of an angle swooping up, so that gravity pulls this front area right here down directly onto the box, right on this area right here, and it closes the lip entirely. So that means because our groove is slightly above, we have to be very careful with that though. If we put it too high, the box lip will run into, it will hang over too much of the box wall itself, and it will just run into it right here, and it gets very problematic. We need the box base to be here, and the lip, when it's pulled all the way out, should only be hanging over by about that 64th, barely hanging over there. And then we go in and we place a slight back bevel on this piece right here, and it just kind of ramps itself up and in there. And you can't even feel it if it's done right. It feels like it's just sliding straight in and out, but we're kind of tricking ourselves here with the eye and using gravity to make that little gap disappear while also keeping it perfectly smooth. Now, the other conundrum of this is that then that causes our actual lid to be slightly higher. And if you have that up-swinging cup, you run into problems in the back here, in which case we then bevel that on the top and or bottom, depending upon which way your cup is going, so that it also slides as if it is perfectly level, but it's actually kind of sneaking its way under. I'll walk through all of this as we go to cup, but I think it's very important to understand the concept before. We are essentially slanting our lid a little bit, we're going in, and it acts as if it slides in there perfectly, making the gap disappear entirely. We're looking at the box front on now. Remember, I've got a slight cup up, so I've got low point here, high point here. And in order to determine where to cut this, we are looking for these two low points. And we're going to essentially mark this out by just sitting this up against there. But we want to mark that and then go up by about that 64th of an inch. So we're looking to just do this instead of trying to like measure around here. We're just going to use the lid itself as our marking point. So mark your lowest point on the bottom of these and then mark up a little bit more by a 64th of an inch. And that's going to be the kind of base of the lid. I know this is my low point here. I'm going to mark that. And then when I draw my actual line, I'm going to come up slightly from there. And in theory, our high point of the groove will be about here, but maybe a little bit higher due to the cup, depending upon whether you have a cup or not. If you're doing a twist, you essentially have to just do this exact same thing and then finesse the lid from there with a little sanding. So just make sure you found your low point here and you go slightly up from that. For reference, my low point is the pencil mark area on the left. Boy, that's hard to hold. Right here, and then my actual mark for the cut is slightly to the right of that, which is up from that. I want to make sure we understand the setup correctly here. We've got the top of the lip and the bottom of the lip. We want the bottom facing in because our initial cut is going to be that low point cut where we're slightly above, and then we are going to work our way up until it slides on and fits nicely. We don't even have to measure that much. We just want to know where the low point cut is, and then we can just remove material, make the groove wider until it fits, checking every time. So you've got your low point marked out, and I would actually be okay with making your first cut a little too high. I'd rather have it too high than too low. But we like to just take a skim pass here to kind of make sure we're lined up, because if we're a little too low, that's going to be hidden under the lid anyways, so we can always move it up. And if it's just like a 1/64 of an inch deep, no harm, no foul. So line this up to leave the pencil line of your low point. We want to leave that line. We don't want to be cutting it or cutting below it. If you are happy with your skim pass, that is perfect. We are now going to go all the way up to our final depth, for me 7/16 of an inch, because my wood is quite chunky here, before we move the fence back. And we will be moving it backwards as we work our way up the lip, if that makes sense. Don't move this fence until you've gone to full depth. We will then move it and go back up again, etc. We don't want to try to go all the way and then go back and forth. That's really bad for alignment. At this point, you should have gone to full depth on the first pass. And we're going to come up here, and now we're looking for, where's the high spot? What are we aiming for? Obviously, mine is cupping up, so I know somewhere in this area I've done some light sanding to help kind of try to bring that down, but I'm not going to go crazy here. I'm not trying to get this on one go. I'm trying to sneak my way up till it's just a perfect fit. I can come in and hold it flat up against there and just, make a little mark. Hopefully it lines up pretty well with my original one. And that's where I'm aiming for, but I'm not going to try to hit this line. I'm going to try to go up to, about here on the next one, and then come over and check it. And then a little more and come over and check it. If you overshoot this, it becomes a big problem because you don't have a ton of glue surface if it's loose and wobbling around in there. We don't want it to be unbelievably tight. Ideally, we don't want to have to mallet it in there, but we want at least a friction fit. If it gets too loose, you're going to have to shove a bunch of dowels up from underneath there. So we're looking to just sneak up on wherever your high point is. Obviously, if you're cupping the other way, your high points will be out in the corner. And if you've got a twist, well, one of them is going to be higher, one of them is going to be lower, and you'll know that already. When you come back over to do your next passes to expand this, go back down to a 1/16 and work your way up a 1/16 or so at a time. We don't want to take this huge chunk and bite out of there because there's not a ton of material there. We don't want any tear out. We don't want anything to explode. And I personally use, as you will have seen, my hands to do this. I think it's very hard to do this with a push stick and push block and keep it up against there, especially when it gets very tiny. I just feel much more control using my hands, but obviously some people are not going to feel good about that. You can do it however you want, but just take it a little bit at a time, work your way back up to the same height, for me 7/16. Then I can move the fence back. I go down, I go up, fence back, down, up. I just take it that way. It's more time consuming, absolutely. I just don't like trying to one-shot this, not only because it's very hard to get it right, but it feels less safe and it's already a little bit sketchy. At this point, if you're following along closely, this should be getting very close to fitting. Just starting to squeeze in there, but it doesn't quite fit perfectly. And you have two different pathways to go here to get this to fit. If you remember, we are at our second to final or close to our final grit of sanding, but not fully there. One option is, instead of going any deeper on the router and risking overshooting it, we begin doing our sanding on the lid and work up to essentially our final or pretty close to our final grit, maybe a little extra after we've cut it down to length perfectly, but basically to your final grit. And that's probably the safest way to kind of sneak up on this fit. The other is to keep going on your router, but you have to be extremely careful. Once you start getting this to where it's just beginning to kind of slide on there like that, but you otherwise couldn't get it on there without malleting on it. This is kind of like a make or break point. If you get it too big, you lose glue surface and you have to then pin with a dowel or something like that. So consider from here how close you are to your final sanding. If you are pretty close and this is fitting pretty close, consider just sanding to fit. And remember, if you're working with a cup, your likely biggest points of kind of frustration in terms of getting it in are the two undersides. If you're cupping this way, the bottom here, and then top, middle here. Those are likely your points that are preventing it from sliding in there. So start with down the middle and then on the underside on these edges here. I usually just try to get there with the router because I'm a little lazy, but it's much safer to sand. So it's up to you. If you do it on the router and you have a router that's really nice and big and has micro adjust, that's going to be really easy. If you don't, you have to find a way to make sure you only go back a little bit at a time. So just be very careful. We're getting real close right now and we don't want to overshoot this by a ton. And in case you're asking yourself, why don't we want to mallet it in there? That's normally with a joint we'd like to mallet. Well, there are, I guess, 3 reasons. 1, these edges are very fragile and it's very easy to dent them or destroy them. 2, we need glue to get in there. Glue takes up some space before it's all dried. So you quite literally have to pack something else in there and then put the lid on. And 3, it's very hard to line this up independently. The way I line it up, and we will get to this point eventually, is I stick it in there and I slowly press it in there. And oftentimes it'll be a little off to one side and you need to be able to kind of force it back to the center. So it needs to have a little breathing room for the glue to fit in there and for some micro adjusting of getting it to fit. And just for the safety of not destroying these very fragile edges with malleting the lid on there. I've got mine at the fit I want before I do my final grit and then some steel wool. I'm gonna bring you in and try to show you very closely exactly what we're looking for here. And it's hard to kind of convey on camera, but I'm hoping I can show you enough that you understand the fit and the feel of what we're looking for before we do the very final sanding, which we'll do much closer to the end right before we glue it so we avoid scratching it at all. This is the fit we are looking for. I can pull it off of there without a ton of pressure and put it on there without a ton, but it's not going anywhere. I can shake this thing pretty hard. It's not gonna slide off. That's perfect. We got a little bit of room that we can kind of manipulate it so that we can make sure it's nice and centered. Now, obviously there is still that very final little bit of sanding here, which we're gonna do much later, right before we glue this on there to ensure it doesn't get scratched. Things get scratched very easily and it becomes very hard to do any extra sanding right under this lip right here. So we don't want it to be exactly correct. We want it to be really close to exactly correct, but not exactly. That is the fit you are looking for. I hope that can be conveyed over camera. And at that point, we're good to go. You can take your router stuff down, whatever you need to do. We're finished with that groove. Since we've got the lid fit, we can now trim this lengthwise down to size. Ideally, we do not want to touch this front part that fits nice and perfectly, and that we will only then trim from the back. The easiest way to do this is essentially to push this all the way on there, try to get it somewhat centered, slide it in the box, and then this distance between that point and that point are the amount you need to remove roughly. And we want to make it perhaps a 32nd of an inch short so that in case some dust or something were to ever collect in there over time, you're never running into something. It doesn't have to be perfect between the two spaces. I'd rather have it be slightly shorter. And just make sure when you're doing this measurement that you actually have this pushed underneath and up and in there. Sometimes it can get caught if you have a cup on this top lip and you'll think you need to cut more than you do, and you'll cut the thing too short and it won't fit anymore, and it's a disaster. Once we've got the width in a way that we like it, we need to do a little rough sanding to this little guy now to match up with the rest of the box. We did some rough sanding to get all of these kind of prepped and ready. We want this, the face of it, to match up with the face of this. And because we changed the thickness of this front piece, this will now overhang a little bit, totally fine. We're gonna go 150 to 220 maybe so that these, to the feel, match up pretty close. And part of the reason we do that is when we go to glue this together, some of the alignment is not just visual by eye, but it's also by just running our thumbs along the front of that to make sure it feels centered in there. And therefore, we need them roughly the same thickness, this top part, and this little guy right here on the front face, so that we can tell that we are flush against there. You're also probably going to notice, especially if when you glued this up earlier, it wobbled a little bit, that when you set this down, one of these corners on this guy is going to seem high. That's okay. It's probably high on one of these and the other one's lower because of the shifting during the glue up, which can happen. It's usually very little, it's just a little bit, but you can kind of feel it with your fingers. We're going to also just massage sand this to roughly meet the other one. We're going to make sure all of the saw blade marks are out of all of these. And once everything feels flush here, feels flush on the top corners, feels flush on the front, that rough sanding is done. We're good to go with that part. We have to remember with all of this, it doesn't need to measure perfect. You just want it to visually look pretty darn close to perfect, and then in use to feel pretty darn close to perfect. No one's taking a micrometer to this thing to check. It just has to look right and feel right. And if we need to massage sand to get some things to feel and look level, and it's not actually level, doesn't matter. It's going to feel and look that way, which is really the only sensory ability we have to judge something like a box. We have two things left to do. At this point, your front lip should be rough sanded flush with the two top corners in the front face. You should have the groove cut correctly, and you should be able to put it on the lid, slide it in there, and it should look closed, done, etc., etc. We have to place a pretty chunky, in my opinion, back bevel on this lip. So this will be up, this will be facing out the front, and we are applying it to the bottom inside. We do not want to touch this front side. We just want to apply a pretty chunky bevel to the back here. And the reason we do this, in case you're interested, let's say this is the side of the box. This is our front half. This little guy right here is the front. We have, using gravity, our lid hangs slightly down because we want it to close. So it kind of looks like this when it's closed. But when it's not closed, it is reversed a little bit, and our front lip should actually just be barely grazing this front of this box. Now, obviously, when you go to push it in, you could just lift it a little bit. We don't have to do that. We want it to just slide when we push it. So we cut this bevel off of the back here, and it will just naturally ramp itself up and in there. You won't notice, you won't feel anything. It's very smooth. After that, we are going to take our lid and we are going to do the final sanding. Now, we can do a tiny bit of touch up later, but once we glue this little guy on, it's pretty hard to do any, like, especially random orbit sanding, but you can do a little detail at the end. This is the back of my lid, so going into the box like this. Always put a bevel on this top side, a little bevel on the bottom side, but I try not to touch, other than a slight chamfer for feel, the bottom edges of the bottom side, because that's what's resting on there. That's how everything is kind of situated. I try to just, for feel, just a light chamfer, not much at all. But definitely if you have a cup up, you're going to want to put a nice bevel on top here so that it also can slide itself in case in the summer it expands or it cups a little more or something like that. But overall, just get this thing to your final sanding. Be happy with it before we glue it on there. It's now time for my least favorite part of this build and of woodworking in general, the glue up. So much can go wrong and you don't get a second chance in most cases. Now, there are three things we have to look out for here. The first is that if you are planning to use a spray finish before you glue this on, apply some painter's tape or whatever around the area that's going to be under here. Spray a few coats on this front and back before. It's just much easier to do it before you put this on, and then your actual coats on the box can also cover this, but you'll be sure that you've got everything covered already. Trust me, it's just easier to do a little pre-spray. After that, we have the glue problem. And the problem being that if we get any squeeze out on these two sides or under this lip, it becomes really problematic. Under the lip is very hard to clean it out of there. You got to get a chisel out, and you can gouge it out. It's nearly impossible to sand under this little lip here. And then for obvious reasons, if we get glue on the sides here and we push this in while it's still wet, which it's actually important to be able to push this in while the glue is in there, it will glue itself together and it'll just be a box with no sliding lid. The lid will just be glued in place. And the purpose of being able to push it in there is the way I like to do this, just a dry run here. I put my lid in, I leave it, I don't know, a little bit out, maybe a ½ inch out from the lip. I've got glue in here, put my glue in. I try to center it pretty well, and I try to then pull it back with this lid, keeping this lid pretty centered, And then when I get to here, I then put pressure on the lid here and use my fingers to center this, allowing us to then make sure that this matches up flush. It's nearly impossible to just try to line this up out here. You almost always have to use the box itself to align this. And that is why we cannot get glue on the inside here, because it will glue itself shut. I also much like to leave this in place while this is drying to ensure that there is no movement whatsoever. The one little thing we can do to be just a little careful is some kind of object that's a 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch tall. We've got it glued on there. We're pretty happy with it. We just set it to dry with that side facing down so that any glue would have to kind of run up, and that's pretty unlikely. Glue doesn't have its own feet to it. It can't really run that way. So this gives us a bit of a fighting chance if we did put too much. I would much rather, though, have you err on the side of a little bit less than needed, and then we go and just put some dowel pins through here to pin this in. If you put too much on and you've got to clean up a mess, it's really problematic, especially if you're trying to use an oil finish underneath this lip. So just be very careful. I'm going to put the glue in here. I'm going to bring you in. I'm going to try to get you a look at kind of how much is in there. And I know it's hard to tell on camera, but that's the best I can do in terms of giving you an idea of how much glue to put in there. We want to do everything possible to try to leave about a 1/4 inch on either side internally unglued, because the lid, when it pushes in there, will force it out to the side. And then I take a pick and I'm looking to cover as much surface area as humanly possible here. This is what I'm looking for right here. I've stayed away from these two ends and I've stayed away from this very top lip. This is the upside. It will get forced there when you push the lid in. So don't worry about it if it seems like you should put glue there. It will force it there. If you put glue there, it will force it out and you'll have problems. But that's what I'm looking at. That's about what I like there. I may spread this out a little further on the bottom here. So I've got it now. I've got it. I made sure I'm fully pushed in. I've lined it up. I can feel with my fingers that we're pretty darn close to flush. Just do push down one more double check that we're all the way in there. Now we take a peek on either side to make sure we're not spilling out. We have none spilling out the top. I go ahead and I'm going to just close that up. I'm going to go set this to dry. And like I said earlier, I usually set it on a slight angle with the lip facing that way so the glue can't run its way back up. But that's about as smooth as it's going to go. And as you can see, there is no gap there. All right, I'm back. This glued up pretty darn well for me. It's a little sticky, so I got a little bit of sanding around the top too, but I want to go over troubleshooting because some of you watching this will have come out perfect. Others will be having problems right now. The most common problem is that when you go to push this in, it's a little sticky. And what that likely means is one of two things. One, your cup is hitting in the back here, and you need to put more of a bevel on it so that it can slide under, or you need to remove some material in general very carefully from this back area that's sliding under here because it's forcing the lid under there, making it tighter up in these front two areas. Generally, if it's too tight as you're pushing it in, assuming you didn't cut the board too wide in that it's just struggling to fit, it is because it is touching on the inside lip in one of these two areas right here. As this slides in, it gets lifted up. You need to remove some material. You need to identify what area is under the lip in here, what is sitting inside of here, and remove some of it from there. It's almost always in the front, but sometimes it's in the back. If it's a cup and you see it hitting when you slide it in and out, a lot of this can be identified by quite literally just looking at it as it goes in and out. So you're just kind of eyeballing it down. Do you see anywhere that is touching? We don't want it necessarily touching around the top rim. We want it just kind of sitting on the bottom of the groove. Conversely, if your cup is upside down, you may have the two wing, I call them wings because it's going this way, these two little wing tips, if your cup were like that, hitting, or conversely, the bottom of the cup hitting. Apply more of a bevel to it, remove some material. We are able to sand a little bit back in this area because we can get to it easily. it's up under this lip that's a huge problem. So if you're going to do any manipulating of this with sandpaper, stay away from this area inside of this lip and keep it only to what is either on the back outside or what is going to be essentially hidden underneath this groove, and do your best to get it to match whatever we final sanded to earlier. Now, the worst case scenario, and some of you will have run into this, is when you're looking at it front on and you've got a gap on one side or the other. If your gap appears on the left, we then need to deal with material on the right. This can be caused by the upper lip touching in this area on the right, or by this area on the bottom of the slide, that we prefer not to have to touch this area. If you've got an entire gap in front, that means you didn't put your groove high enough and you're gonna have to just remove more material from this whole bottom side or these whole bottom edges to get it to come down. If the gap is nice and even, that's not as big of a problem because you can either just lower it or leave it. If the gap is off to one side, whether the right or left, that means you've probably made your box with a twisted piece of wood. So this little lip is sitting like that or like that. It's rough. It's a little tough. You have to identify what part of the twisted lid is touching and where. So you will take the lid out of the box. You will ideally put it on a flat surface, set it down, and first identify, assuming this was twisted, where your twist is. You are then going to slowly insert it into the box, and you are trying to watch in these back corners here as you slide it in. We want to first find out where in the back we are touching, if we are at all. We need to identify what is pushing up on that little lip that's keeping it up. Sometimes it is a high corner that to slide under there, because it's twisted, it's then propping up the front. So like this to slide into here is pulling that up. If that's the case, then you need to remove material from the top of this back left. It could be left or right. Sometimes it is also underneath that is too far down and it's pushing the other side up, in which case you need to remove from the opposite side bottom. So it's all about identifying, and without me being able to see your box, I can't know for sure what is touching what. It could either be touching on the top or on the bottom, and therefore causing a tilt one side or the other, which will leave you with an awkward gap. The only way to fix that is identifying that and then some trial and error. Don't attack it like crazy. Remove a little bit from the spot you think is the right spot. Check it, look at it again, even if you need to take 2 different photos to see if there's a change. If there is a change, you're on the right track. If there's not, try somewhere else on the bottom. Ideally, you didn't start with a twisted lid or a very twisted lid, and this is not a big problem for you. But sometimes you do, because the lid looks so nice and you just want to use it, and you got to go through and fix it. Trust me, I've had this happen plenty of times early on, especially. We are also at the very end going to apply paste wax inside of these lid grooves, as well as absolutely to the bottom of this thing. We don't apply it anywhere near the front edge of this, but to the bottom of this, and oh, it just slides in so smoothly like butter. So if it's a little tight, but nothing else is really a problem, it's quite possible it'll be totally disappeared, fixed by that. Though if it is tight, back and forth this way, that's going to be problematic if you're building this in the winter, and you may at this point already want to start sanding some down. One other problem you can have is if you glued this up incorrectly, and instead of getting full contact with the front lip across, it's at a bit of an angle. It's like kind of angled off to the side, so you're pushing it in and it's kind of hitting there and then going back. You can either leave that and it will still shut in there, or you can add a slight taper on that so that it seems to go straight in there and it'll feel better. That's up to you. If it still closes, then it's not the biggest problem in the world. If it's not closing, you're going to have to add, or remove, I should say, oh, a little note in there, some area from whatever side is hitting in first. Sometimes it'll kind of come in like that if you didn't glue it correctly. It's annoying, but if it still closes, it's fine. And hopefully that's all. I'm trying to think through all of the potential problems, and those are the ones I can think of right now. If you have anything else, leave it in the comments. Do your best to describe it to me, and I will try to give you what I think the correct answer to your problem is. Got 2 steps left here. The first one is that when you glued on the front lip, you may be able to feel that it doesn't line up perfectly. Sometimes you get it right the first time. Other times we got to do just a little bit of flushing up, a little finessing. Ideally, it looks like it connects well on the top, and maybe one side kind of is just sticking out a little more. You can just feel it. Ideally 220 on a sanding block that's larger than the entire front, or at least big in general. You may be doing something quite large. And you hit that, it keeps it flat, it gets it all in reference surface. You'll see after the first few swipes, area that's being removed and area that's not. Go until the whole thing looks like it's got a nice sanding scratch on it. After that, we want to touch up the top here. And this is where I kind of whip out the random orbit sander. I go sanding wise 150, 220, 320, 400 by hand, quadruple aught steel wool, and the 320 is where I whip out the random orbit sander for just the lightest pass or two, because for whatever reason, it just seems to be able to get out any kind of errant 220 scratches better than anything else. Just be careful. If you're going to use the random orbit sander for all of this, it is so easy, and I know I've mentioned this before, to round over this whole thing and to just destroy that kind of crispness. So be very careful. Once you've got it to the sanding you like and it looks all good, we'll go ahead and apply the finish. Like I said, I go all the way to quadruple aught steel wool because then when I apply the oil, I like simple finishes. I get a heavier sheen and then the easeability of applying the oil finish. So I'm gonna get this sanded and then we will get the finish on there. Just for reference, this is what it looks like after a swipe or two. You can see I've got a high spot kind of going in this area, low spot here on this lip, and so my sanding block is making contact up here and with here, and I just go until all of this looks like this same kind of sanded color. It should only take 35-40 seconds. We're at the final step here. I'm going boiled linseed oil, whatever you're choosing to do. Obviously, you can do it however suggested if you're spraying it, etc. I would highly suggest that if you're using any sort of running oil, there are three sort of that you must do. The first is that when you're going to get it to dry it off, get the excess off of there, make sure you get back in these bottom corners in the back. It's very easy for some to sit in there, harden, and then it blocks the lid. If you have an air compressor, or ideally an air compressor, spray some air around the base of this thing here and it will flush any out down to the back and you can easily wipe it off. You can even spray both ways and get it on both sides. And then I highly suggest for any sort of oil or runny finish whatsoever, when you apply it to this, it will, at least some of it, will go slightly under this lip and sit in there. So it'll soak in a little bit, it'll sit in there. When you go to dry this, obviously wipe it off as well as you can, spray a little compressed air under there, but make sure you dry it sitting this way. In case you miss anything, we want it to be running towards that and not back out the side. If it comes back out, it'll harden, it'll be thicker, and it'll have a sheen to it that's more than everywhere else. It doesn't look good, and it's nearly impossible to get off because it's so tight in there. But beyond that, obviously just one final check for scratches. I much prefer to paint it on, even though I am flooding it on there. I find I can just kind of be more detailed with certain areas, especially around the rim. It's just a personal thing that I like to paint the oil on rather than rubbing it on, but that's just me. Flood it on there. As soon as you've got every area clearly covered in oil, set a timer for 10, 12 minutes, something like that, but keep an eye on it. If anywhere gets dry, apply more oil. Make sure you keep it saturated, what do they call that, flooded, until the 12 minutes. Wipe it all off. Wipe it off pretty good, right? We don't want any oil sitting on the surface. Set it down to dry, come back in about 5 minutes, and especially depending upon the type of wood, some wood seep out a little bit of oil through the pores. If you see anything seeping out, if there's a knot, there's a good chance some will seep back out of there. Wipe it off, and then you should be good to go, and just let it dry 24 hours. You can apply 2 coats, 3 coats, whatever you want if you're doing the boiled linseed oil. If you flood it on the first time, you'll only need maybe a light little rub coat after that externally, and you can do that 24 hours later. Let it dry for 5 days or so. If you're using any kind of oil-based finish, as always, we have to lay them out to dry, whether it's outside or somewhere open in your shop. Spread the towels out, let them dry until they're hard. Can take a day, 2 days, depending upon how saturated it is. But we don't want to burn our shops down. So just make sure you do that. I feel like I always need to say that just in case somebody didn't know that before. And the final thing to do before you apply the finish is to sign your work. You spent a lot of time making this. You should be proud of it. Put your name on there, throw a date on there, or initials, whatever you want to do. And maybe in 30 years, somebody will find it, and it'll be a little piece of you and your work left behind for somebody in the future to see. That's going to do it for today. That's the full box build. I'm extremely happy with how this turned out. I think it's beautiful. Obviously, the wood is carrying a lot of the load here, Beautiful wood will make better looking projects, even if it's the same build quality throughout. If I made this out of pine, it would not look anywhere near this good. So hopefully that helps. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Timestamps, again, if you're looking for something specific, will be below. Thank you so much for joining me today. I had a lot of fun. Bye.